Evening, everyone. Huge thank you for everyone who's here tonight. My name is Meher Wani, and I oversee membership here at the Arts Club. It's my pleasure to introduce our special guest this evening. We have Hans Ulrich Obrist, creative director of Serpentine Galleries, and Miles Greenberg, renowned performance artist and sculptor. A huge thank you to Luca, founder of Albion Jeune Gallery that just opened in May. And they'll be exhibiting Miles Greenberg and Douglas Gordon's show called 2424, which just opened yesterday and will be on at Albion Jeune Gallery until the start of August, so please do visit it. I'll now hand over to Hans to commence. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm very excited to be in conversation here with Miles. We met exactly 9 years ago in Canada when I curated a show of Brazilian art and have had a dialogue ever since. So it's wonderful that today we can have this conversation, of course, on the occasion of the exhibition Miles is doing with Douglas Gordon at Albion Jeune, an exhibition which will go until July the 28th. And I thought it was a very interesting idea to combine Miles's work and Douglas's work because Miles, from the very beginning, you looked at sculpture, and you actually told me once that you don't want to be described as a performance artist, but more as an artist who uses the body as a medium. And this very sculptural aspect is, of course, also very present in Douglas Gordon's film, which basically slows down Hitchcock film to an extent where basically all of a sudden we experience it in a way we've never experienced it before. I thought we could start the conversation with the beginnings, but before that, I thought it would be wonderful if we can all give Miles a very warm welcome.
Wow. Oh, the lights.
We also thought we're not going to do this in a sort of a linear way, you know, with the PowerPoint presentation and then go from A to B to C, but more, you know, free. And so we're going to have images in the background, and you will see that we're, you know, going to talk about these works, but in a maybe slightly, you know, less linear way. I wanted to begin with the beginning, Miles.
Wait, before you do, I really want to do it too. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause for Hans Ulrich Obrist. Thank you. Okay, we're even.
Thank you, Miles.
Let's go.
And I thought it would be great to begin with the beginning because we met so early. You were 17 when we met for the first time, but you already knew then very precisely that you wanted to become an artist and that you were an artist. And but before that, you initially wanted to be a fashion designer. You were very fascinated by Alexander McQueen. You said that basically Alexander McQueen was everything for you, the autonomy of the models and the visuals. And as we're here in London, I thought it would be interesting to kind of begin with that, and maybe you tell us a little bit about your very early fascination for Alexander McQueen and how then you came to art, or how art came to you.
How did you remember that? That's not even on the internet. Hello and thank you. And first and foremost, also thank you to the Arts Club, and thank you to Luca Hugh Williams as well as Albion Jeune for having us here today. And for me, having me in the space with the legendary Douglas Gordon. Very, very early beginnings. I think that to me, so I grew up on a tour bus with a mother who was an actress at the time in the theater. So I think the drama of kind of, you know, creating these particular spaces or these kind of zones in which the body could be extended, dramatized, centered, and kind of and accentuated in certain ways that spoke to a very poetic sensibility. To me, was always kind of like, you know, felt sacred, felt second nature, felt like something very regular and routine. And so I think McQueen was definitely my first, or one of my very first loves. In terms of how he would extend his emotional landscape and the emotional landscapes of the narratives of the place he comes from, and just, you know, here, and stories and mythologies through articulating that through something that transforms people. And I always resonated with that. I think the same way that I always resonated with like classical sculpture and the ways in which it, the sort of human form, recognizing the human form one human form to another has always been really, really core to my understanding of the world. I don't understand much else, but I definitely understand the body. And I guess that, fashion design felt like the most logical avenue at the time to finding a way to change us.
And you had a lot of travels with your mother, and basically were basically involved in the theater world. But you realized that theater wasn't your thing, and as you said, you were more attracted to sculpture. And then when you were 12, something very important happened, because you went with your mother to MoMA and encountered for the first time Marina Abramovic. It was at MoMA where Marina had this performance, the artist is present, curated by Klaus Biesenbach. And I wanted to hear a little bit what happened there, because it was an epiphany for you.
It definitely was an epiphany. Shout out to Marina. She, of course, had this gigantic retrospective, and the structure of the show, which we all know and love, was that you walk into the atrium, you see her, and there's two tables in this charismatic space, and then the whole show. And I think the sort of historical kind of lineage of it made a lot of sense to me. And then I kind of got to this space of these like transitory objects, which she has created, these like sculptures that you're meant to interact with, and that kind of channel your energy in a particular way, in a performative way, in the museum space. And I thought that was really cool. And I found, these objects that make my body do something. I found they really affected me physiologically in ways that I think opened up a lot of kind of neural pathways as a 12-year-old. And then by the time I got out of the exhibition and I saw her sitting there still, I think I didn't get to sit in front of her. I didn't have the capacity for a line that long at the time, but it was, I think it really started molding my thinking. So I started writing performance pieces from around that age. And then I started performing in nightclubs and DIY spaces in Montreal and abroad whenever I could, with a big ID from like 16 onwards. And then,
And you also said once in a conversation that the goal of a successful performance is in a way to affect the audience, and it often has to do with freezing time, maybe freezing time being the goal of all art. And that's something which, of course, had to do with this experience you had at 12 when you encountered Marina, that moment of freezing time. But can you talk a little bit about that, and what else for you constitutes a successful performance?
For me, a performance is sort of like, it's always been kind of like a petri dish. It's creating like this poetic set of circumstances that is fertile ground for a particular idea to take place, to take root, and to grow and to proliferate. And so, I think of it as like, if I have like this feeling, we've all had these feelings somewhere in our chest, somewhere in our gut, somewhere in our, shoulder, spleen, wherever. And it could be this kind of burning, nagging thing that you don't really know what it is, but if you want to find out, there are all these kind of ways of kind of extracting that, and people have done that through various art forms, through writing, through, every art form. And I think that performance for me has always come from like a very kind of, a much older tradition within the African diaspora that I've always been interested in, particularly around ritual, around like voodoo practices and things like that, where, you kind of go into the body in these very, very extreme and at times violent ways, going in beyond one's physical capacity, just to kind of, like tap into the secret parts of us that we don't understand, know about, or have language for. So I think for me, a successful performance is always when I feel like I've learned a secret.
Beautiful. And you did something very unusual when you were 17. You basically dropped out of school, and that must have happened very soon after we met, probably, yeah, a few
Days, hours.
You dropped out of school and then really made your own, in a way, curriculum. You just met people, which has always been also my conviction. And the most important thing is kind of mentorship. And you started to have all these amazing, mentors, make all these experiences. You went to Haiti and studied voodoo there. But also, Bhutto played a very important role. You went to Japan and studied Bhutto, and I had this amazing experience, to interview Katsuo Ono, who was, I think I saw the last performance when he came to Europe. Arata Isozaki took me to that in Venice. That was his last trip. He was almost 100. And then when I interviewed him, he was like 101 or 102. And he showed us all these incredible sketches and explained us, the kind of vision of Bhutto. Can you talk a little bit what inspired you so much about this form of dance of Bhutto and what you learned in Japan and then in Haiti? I mean, in a way, it's what one would call in German kind of Lehr- und Wanderjahre. It's almost like the Grand Tour, no? Historically, you went on this journey to learn, and it would be great to hear more about that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that, that sense of kind of interconnectedness in the world came, I think really from not knowing where I was from. Like, my mom was adopted. I had no contact with my father's family, or later him, and so for me it was largely coming from like a sense of like placelessness. And I think it was like David Hammons who said, I'm not from anywhere, and that's a beautiful place to be. I did my first Bhutto workshop in Montreal with Yumiko Yoshioka, who was an original member of Daira Kodokan, which was like a very, very legendary dance troupe in Tokyo. And I just remember, I was probably like 15 at the time, 14, 15, when I did this. And I remember one of the first things that we learned was to kind of do these like circles with your hips, and then to shrink that circle by half, and then shrink that circle again by half, and then shrink that circle again, and you go down to a centimeter, and then a millimeter, and then half a millimeter, a quarter of a millimeter, a tenth of a millimeter, and until you, like, we're all standing in a circle doing this, and everyone feels themselves making these circles with their hips, but no one can see any movement, and everyone looks like they're standing stock still, but there is this constant orbit happening. So that tension and that understanding of like moving the inside of your body first to kind of articulate, movement has always been like really interesting to me. And I was also wildly obsessed with anatomy and biology and physiology, and I still am. I mean, I like take upwards of 25 pills a day, which are all vetted by a doctor. But yeah, I'm like for me, when we're speaking about like movement practices, which I feel like I don't talk about a lot because I really fixate on the sculptural aspect of my work, but like the particular sort of body stuff for me really has to do with, like almost like a choreography of like the organs and understanding how they move, understanding peristalsis, tapping into it, and having like, almost like as much contact as you can with the part of your nervous system that you don't control, and then just working from that. That's I guess that's the Japanese influence on.
And then Haiti?
Haiti, when I was in Haiti, I tell this story a lot. It's like I assisted like voodoo ceremony around Day of the Dead. I was present for it. It was sort of in the countryside, and this group came to where we were, staying, the town we were staying in, and they brought all these mattresses, and they just laid down these mattresses around the grounds of where they were going to be performing the ceremony. And I was like, okay, like maybe they're going to camp out tonight or something, I don't know. And as they started to perform these rituals, and people started to, move and kind of, go into these very, very intense states of hypnosis, people just started falling, and passing out, and then someone from the crowd would just pick them up by the limbs and throw them onto a mattress, and then they would come to about 15 minutes later, and they would keep going, and then someone else would pass out, and it would just keep going. And so I was wildly fascinated with how people like this like intuition to go so far above and beyond the capacities of your own body in reverence of the divine and in pursuit of an idea. So yeah, that I think really inspired me. And I think when people are like, "Oh my God, well, it's must be so hard to do these things," I'm like, no, because I'm really focused on the objective, the idea, the image, the petri dish, creating the conditions for a revelation, for contact with the divine, and then the body, the pain, the whatever else, is totally incidental.
Maybe a last question about the beginnings, and we're then going to talk about the works, about the exhibition here, is still in this idea of mentorship. No, I mean, I never studied, curation. I just worked with two great, museum directors, with Caspar Koenig in Germany and Suzanne Paget in France, and I really learned everything from them on the job in the early 90s. And in a way, when I look at your trajectory, it's quite similar. You just learned on the job, and you toured with a very important choreographer from Canada, Edouard Locke, and went on tour. And I kind of love this idea that you just basically followed, Edouard Locke on this tour and learned a lot of things there. Can you talk about that and what you learned from Locke? Because it was a tour, I think, which went to Beijing.
Yeah, so it was actually, it was for a workshop project in Beijing, where he set up a workshop there with the Beijing Dance Academy. And before I abandoned my academic career, I took night classes in all the languages of the countries I wanted to live and work in, like in high school. So I was like, I can have one marketable skill if nothing works out. So I learned Chinese, I learned Mandarin, and I was basically getting coffee and Coca-Cola and cigarettes every day in Mandarin for him. But in addition to that, I was translating for some of the dancers. I was, sort of the videographer. I was the sound engineer. I was kind of doing all the bits and bobs around. But no, I think his way of working was really, really fascinating to me. Same with Bob Wilson, who I did the Watermill Center with. I think the two of them combined really put this idea in my brain of like, intuition, and just kind of going with what you think makes sense and that's right. Which I think really overrode, not to discourage university as a format, but that really overrode the need for any kind of academic infrastructure for me, because I don't know, Edward never studied as a dancer, really. Like he was, as far as I know, he was mostly a writer before he started choreography, which I thought was really cool. Just decide something, and that's how you make art.
And it's very DIY, and you started to do these performances, in, as you said, in clubs. But then, a couple of years ago, they started to happen more and more. Even you were in your early 20s, they started to happen more and more also in galleries, and then, of course, in museums. And that brings us actually to one of the earlier images in the presentation, which keeps coming back, which is Oyster Knife, which, of course, is relevant in the discussion of the exhibition here. And it's a work actually from 2020, a very long durational performance, which was really extreme. It tested limits and also physical limits. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the rule of the game of this performance and how the idea was born.
Yeah, this piece totally changed my life on a lot of levels. So Oyster Knife happened right on the heels of, I think it might be the next image in the slide. Anyway, if it's not, pneumatherapy, which I did, which was in New York. I'd just done another piece right before called Hemotherapy. It was this whole series that were very kind of high aesthetics. We have it here. But it was there you go. Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. You summoned it. 5,000 plus stems of lilies and hyacinths and the most like fragrant and kind of like bombarding, sensorial experience. I was on this stone which was rotating at 2 rotations per minute we actually showed the video here in London several years ago, for 7 hours. It was this very, I was being dripped with cane sugar syrup, and everything was like very sumptuous. It was about grief, and I felt like I had just come out of a residency at Palais de Tokyo. I just moved to New York. I think I'd lived there for about 5 months, and then suddenly COVID hit, like out of nowhere. And I was just getting this momentum and this very this very pretty world that I was starting to create to myself, And suddenly I had no production capacities, I had no audience, and I couldn't be around anyone, and no one could be around anyone. And then George Floyd, and then the uprising, and happy Juneteenth, by the way. It was whatever, unprecedented times. We went through that. I think I was faced with a choice. I was camping out at my mom's place in Montreal, as to whether I would continue to work and find ways to work, or if I would just completely incubate and kind of do nothing. And this piece kind of hit me like a ton of bricks as soon as, and I guess I don't really talk about this and so much in the text or in the, I keep it a little bit discreet as to the origins of this work, but the reality is it happened when Ahmaud Arbery got shot. And I was just thinking about the gesture of running as a very simple, kind of motor image. And because, he was this black man who was, for those who don't know, shot, by random white militia, racist militia in somewhere in the States. And he was a couple years older than me, I think, at the time. But he was just running around the neighborhood. So I thought this lacked poetry so profoundly. It was, terribly, terribly anticlimactic. And that, I don't know, that just didn't rest well in my soul. And it was also, simultaneously I had a bombarding, any black person in this audience knows that, your phone would get hot every day with how many people would ask you, are you okay? And then can you do this Instagram live? And then can we give get a quote? So it was a little overwhelming, and I didn't know how to process any of that, because my fear of police and my fear of getting shot and my fear of all of that was deeply private. It was a secret. I didn't need people asking me if I was okay, because I never was, but I was okay with that. So anyway, I had to find a way to interpret this through my own poetic lens and exercise it, and I thought create some kind of maybe an homage that could heal, me, his spirit, my spirit, some spirit, something. And this felt like the answer. So I spoke to Marina about it. She helped me sort of co-produce it. We streamed it on her platform, on MAI. And by the time I actually got around to doing it...
Marina's Institute, yeah.
Marina Abramovich Institute. By the time I actually got around to doing it, then Elijah McClain was murdered, and he looked a lot more like me. Was the exact same age as me, same build. So it was all very haunting. But I think ultimately it was, putting that emotion, speaking of this idea of the Petri dish, putting that emotion and that concept and that, lighting that incense in that altar for 24 hours of just this walking gesture, I think transformed a lot of that grief and a lot of that heaviness and a lot of that fear into something that I ultimately still hold, as a poetic sense of unity and transcendence that even for just a minute, resolved things for me.
Thank you so much. And of course, it's also a love letter, as you once said, a love letter to the performance art of the 70s. And you said specifically to the great black pioneers of endurance. And you mentioned Senghor Ngudi, David Hammonds, but of course also Pope L, who we have to remember here, one of the great performance artists of all times. And I wanted to hear a little bit about this aspect of the piece, know that it's a love letter to these pioneers.
Well, so, you know, you saw the glam in the previous work that I had just done right before, and I had no such glam in Montreal in the depth of COVID. You know, production and lights and cameras and what have you. I was lucky enough to get access to a theater, an empty theater in Montreal, and you know, Amazon to order this conveyor belt. When I spoke to Marina about it, I was like, this is going to be very different from most of my work because I'm usually somewhat more disguised. But I felt as though because it's going through the camera that you have to kind of push through the lens. You know, you can't just put you can't put a barrier in front of yourself, in front of the lens like that if you really want to kind of access people. It was really an experiment. This was never supposed to be like a work. You know, this was like an exercise for me. And she told me, she was like, well, in the 70s, we all just wore dirty white, dirty black, or dirty gray. So I chose dirty gray. And yeah, it felt, I think I was trying to go more into the spirit, because it felt unlike me, but it felt more in the spirit of like people that I really looked up to from that era. Senghor Ngudi being like my North Star. Ana Mendieta as well. It's like, I feel like everything I do is somehow an homage to Ana Mendieta in a way, in my heart. And then, you know, of course, Pope L.
Yeah, forever, Pope L. And one thing I wanted to ask you also is that soon after this, we can see in the presentation that you started to then also involve multiple performers in the performance. It became, you know, you started to cast not only, you know, one or two, but like bigger groups of performers. You did here a performance actually in Marina Abramovich's exhibition, which she did at the South Bank. That was an example for that. In the presentation, we have also Late October, which is, I think, one of the earlier pieces of that. Can you talk about how that happened?
Yeah, I mean...
Because it's a big change in the practice, no?
Yeah, I mean, so my first thing in an institution or in like a sort of more official art space ever was actually groups. At the Palais de Tokyo during my residency there. It wasn't really official as an exhibition or as works, but there were sort of like these exercises that I would do because I felt like the program was going to allow me to do these sort of experiments with other people. And even before anyone ever invited me to do anything, I was just, you know, renting with my own money like a studio, like a dance studio for like a day in Paris and just casting and just being like, okay, a bunch of people that I would meet at a nightclub, you know, and some friends from like the House of Ninja and some friends from here and there would all just kind of get together and I would just direct these like sort of static pieces, these like sort of vignettes for like, you know, 3 hours in an afternoon and kind of just create these compositions. So it was always in my brain that I would do this at some point. Like I had this weird idea to like make an opera that never really happened, you know. Yeah. But I think working with other people is very, very different from working alone because I can always ask more of myself than, you know, a large group of people. You know, and so I definitely push myself a little harder in the solo works than I do with my children. But they, you know, I think like I never rehearse anything for myself, and I rarely will do what I would ever call a rehearsal with groups. But I just have them in for like an hour, and I kind of explain the work, and I'm like, okay, find space for you in this. Here are the points that you sort of have to hit. Here's what looks good. Here's what works. Here's the language. But say what you want with it, and find something for yourself here. So I think because this is such a transformative kind of space, you know, these durational 8, 9, 10, 12, 24-hour works for me, I think it needs to have enough room for the performers, for it to be the case for the performers as well. Otherwise, the audience won't, you know, the spell does not happen. Yeah, I think it's very, very important that all the performers are you know, I don't choreograph them ever. You can't choreograph 9 hours. You have to go into a state of hypnosis, so I just do my best to kind of create a conducive space to that.
But that actually was something I was asking myself when I saw water in a heat wave. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit, because that was a very, very complex performance here in London at the South Bank, an exhibition curated by Marina, a group show where you did this very big piece. And I was wondering there, exactly that, you know, it's probably, there's a lot of improvisation involved. It's not fully scripted. Could such a performance in the future be repeated? How do you relate to this idea of a performance score? Because obviously in performance history there are these scores, and then either they can be followed exactly, or in Fluxus there are open scores, so there's kind of free interpretation of the scores. Do you have scores of these performances? Could you ever imagine that in the future, in 50 or 100 years, somebody totally else would redo it?
The group pieces, yes. Like I would say it's a pretty clear score. You know, one of my performances has been acquired, and that was like upon request. So I really had to kind of come up with like how and which one would be appropriate for that, for like a museum to be able to kind of keep it as an object. So I've been thinking more and more about that for sure. Some of the like solo works I would not ever license in such a way, because like they might have a score, but they're sealed off and off limits, I think, forever. Sebastian being one of them, I think. Just like Marina told me, she was like, she would never, ever, ever let anyone do Rhythm Zero ever again, because I asked, and I wanted to do it. Because I was like, yeah, like it would be so, how different would it be for like, it was actually for the Carré show, this show, where I ended up, you know, making this new work called Landscape with Figures, which like before I came up with this, I was like, well, I kind of don't really have anything. And the ask came at a bit short notice. I was like, can I do a recreation? I've never done a recreation of an older piece. Can I do Rhythm Zero? And she was like, never. Like, really, no. Like, it was like, which I was like, fair. Which, being a good mother. Yeah, but I think, you know, listen, maybe ask me that in 40 years. I'm 26.
Yeah, we'll come back. We'll come back to the question. There will be many more interviews. And we'll also hear more from Marina and about Marina very soon, because I'm excited to announce that we received a question here from Marina Abramovic, which I'm going to play especially for tonight, the question for Miles. But before that, I have a few more questions. One thing which is also, I think, very important in looking, you know, at the presentation you put together for tonight, and it struck me actually in many of the pieces of yours I saw, is the presence of not only the performers as living sculptures, but really also the presence of water. You use a lot of water in the installation. Sometimes the visitors, you know, is of course, it brings in the visitors because it's also mirroring the audience. So it's a participatory element. It's at the same time also very much, you know, a constituting element of your performances since the beginning. Could you talk about the importance of water in the practice?
Sure. I think I've tried to like develop and like accrue kind of like a long list of like little things, kind of elements that I think help the audience get to where I need them to see the work. Because I don't like asking a lot of the audience. Like, I think it's important that people be able to flow in and out of the space kind of freely. You know, you can talk, you can take pictures, you can do whatever. But there are little things that I do to kind of hypnotize people without them knowing. And so, like, I think water is sort of one of them. Using more viscous fluids, like syrup is another one. Because if you see water and then you see syrup, which is dripping down from the ceiling, but very, very slowly, you'll sort of, I think your brain will not understand the difference, and somehow you see just this very slow water. It slows down your sense of time. Water, when you move through it, when the performers move through it, when any little disruption happens, it highlights minutia. So it makes people see the tiniest little gesture, the smallest flick of the pinky, any little thing that you do, any sort of, you know, trembling by the end of the performance, right? Because that's just the way these fall apart after 8 hours is just as important as the beginning to me. The way that the water moves when you do, just makes you see the small things you would have missed otherwise. It's just as simple as that. It's just tricks of the eye. You know, I try to make the light hit you when you walk through the door so that you get a stronger sort of difference between when you walk through a doorway on one side to the other. Just little things like that, really kind of smell is another one. The contact lenses on the eyes where you can't see the pupil is totally another one. You see the body more as an object when you can't see the personhood through the irises. All those little things just come to bring the audience into the headspace.
Another, I think, important aspect in several of the works is that when Panofsky said the future is invented with fragments from the past, and we've talked a lot about, your connection, inspiration from also a history of performance art of the 60s and 70s, your mentors, but you go much further back in your work in history, and you connect to ancient art. And I think one of the really interesting kind of projects which is evolving and also shows that in a way a performance in that sense doesn't have a beginning and an end, but you basically do it in one place and then it can evolve. So it's like a living organism, is what happened somewhere between the Louvre and then Venice. You worked with our friend Donatien Grau in the Louvre and then with our friend Klaus Biesenbach, actually with Berg Grün in Venice, on two pieces which are deeply related. It began with a live study actually at the Louvre because, as I'm sure many of you know, the Louvre has done quite a lot of performance work over the last, I would say, 2 years since Donatien is there, and has invited artists to really visit the collection. And you did a video there and designed these arrows, these extraordinary arrows with Chris Habana, and these arrows went through your skin. So it was I remember we spoke a few days before you did this performance. It was a very intense process for you. The museum, basically performance happened in the closed Louvre, so no one else was in the Louvre for 5 hours. And in a way you described that as a test for what then happened in Venice. And it's also a work about portraiture. It's a work, I mean, you all see it in the presentation behind us. It's a portrait of Saint Sebastian, of course, something which, again, is recurrent in the canon of art history. So you connect really to a much older art history. You connect to mythology. Can you tell us a little bit about that in general, and then maybe about this still evolving piece with Saint Sebastian in particular?
Yeah. Thanks for highlighting that they did actually go through my skin, because a lot of people from the images think that they're prosthetics, and I'm like, I am happy to show you the scars after this talk. But yeah, those were very real. Yeah, I don't know. Saint Sebastian has always been like a figure I was quite enamored with, and I think has been sort of a recurring character in queer artists' work since time immemorial, sort of as a signpost for queerness, throughout art history. So I was quite fascinated with him. I was also really fascinated in Venice with the sort of the Moorish sculptures, the Blackamoor sculptures, the Moretti, which have been there for centuries. And I they've always interested me as these figures that don't have an identity. And I think I might have first encountered them when I was like 12, and I just remember the sort of mutual trauma and inspiration that I felt towards them as these these soundless, noiseless kind of figures that are doorknobs. They're posts. They're table legs. They're these figures that hold up everything in the city in some way or another. So I kind of wanted to I shortly thereafter discovered that they often come back in a lot of my performances without me having realized. I thought Venice was a perfect place to somehow give them, a sainthood or something. So I wanted to portray Saint Sebastian as this sort of Moorish figure, or like thinking about these like ebony carved figures. We happen to also be doing this show in Palazzo Malipiero, which is directly facing the Carrezzonico Museum, this museum of 17th century art from Venice, which is full of them. And so I actually, I don't know if you know about this, because I don't know if Klaus likes talking about it in public, but I kind of went on an art heist.
I want to know more about that. That's new.
Yeah, so, you know, a lot of this is focused, I think, on my performances. Like, I do a lot of sculptures as well, and sculptures that particularly, you know, come out of the performances through 3D scanning, and this particular method of 3D scanning that I've invented with, you know, sort of a handheld 3D scanner that I've modified. But, you know, what I really wanted to do for this show originally, I was like, because we're straight across the water from this Karetsoninko Museum, they have these beautiful blackamoor sculptures, like based off of Ethiopian slaves from 16-something, that I was like, I would love to have them populate the space, like a salon in where we wanted to do the performance. And of course, Klaus was like, they're not gonna say yes to that. And I was like, okay, fine. So what I'll propose is that I go as a researcher and I 3D scan all of them with my scanner, and not telling them what it was for, but then just like 3D print out a copy and just like, you know, steal it. Why not, you know? And he was like, okay, like, I'll write an email. And, you know, I only had one day to make this work. Basically, I pinpointed the date where I was like, if I'm gonna get them in time, I need to go on this date. On my way to Japan, I'm gonna draw this crazy travel line through the earth to get to Tokyo via Venice, which doesn't exist. And I went to Venice for 19, so I booked it like the second he said, I'll write the email. I was like, okay, I booked it, assuming it would be a maybe. And of course, like 2 days before I have to take off, they're like, fill out this form and maybe in a month. And I was like, okay. So I went anyway. And left my scanner at home, but I was like, there's actually a very rudimentary 3D scanning software you can download for iPhone. And I just went in with a baseball cap and glasses, and my collar popped up, and I just pretended to be a sculpture student from Paris. And I just took the program, you know, just like this, and had my phone like here, and I was just like, oh, that's pretty, and just scanned the whole thing. Until ultimately I, you know, got gently asked a few times to move on. And I was like, thank you, I got everything I need. So I actually stole 13 sculptures in about 2 hours. And then I went home, loaded them into my computer, sent them to Rome, and had them 3D printed, and had one big, beautiful Andrea Brustalon replica in my show.
And of course, sculpture plays a role, because you do actually work more and more with sculpture as well. So that's not a one-off. It's something which is embedded in the practice.
Mostly they're me and the other performers, actually. All of them are, except for these. This was a special project, a special illegal, really fun project.
Now, a last question I wanted to ask you, actually 2 last questions before we open it up, is you basically are born after 1989. Tim Berners-Lee, you know, invented the World Wide Web in 1989, and you are a generation kind of growing up with the internet. And I was very curious to hear a little bit, because obviously your work is very, very physical, and it's very sculptural. But I wanted to ask you a little bit how you connect to technology, because you do work with avatars. And I also remember in our earliest conversations once that you, at that time, and I'm not sure if that's still the case, but you were very, very passionate about video games. There was particularly one video game, I forgot now which one, but you played one video game again and again.
Probably World of Warcraft.
Yeah, exactly.
I was very deep into World of Warcraft.
Exactly. So I want to ask you, you know, about technology, and because in a way there is a connection between video games, your performances, your avatars.
Yeah, I think the sensibility around the world building aspect is really big for me. Also just like the total immersion of being in a world for that many sort of hours at a time, and completely just kind of putting your brain into another landscape that becomes your whole life. But also just the aesthetics of it, and the things, you know, the visuals that I've always really responded to, you know, and in anime and in all of these sort of, you know, kind of nerdy pursuits that I grew up with. Not having tons of friends in elementary or high school. but now, I think that those things have developed into just like a really big part of how I see things. Like, I was born in '97, so I like the early things that I remember absorbing were like Battlestar Galactica and Mirror's Edge and these sort of like the Xbox games that kind of had this particular fantasy about them that I think made it into I was talking about this yesterday at the show where it's like I think early '70s performance artists always would, the documentation that we know of their work was always kind of incidental and often by other people, just sort of passersby or visitors. And it's these grainy photographs you have of like Teresa Hakyung Cha or, Scott Burton. Marina did a lot of her own, but then there were tons of people who really just didn't give a shit, Like they just didn't really do it with much intention. And we know and love that work, but through, I think, a language that didn't really develop with so much intention. So I always wanted to make work from the get-go that I knew I could consume really well. And so that, in come these aesthetics of like early 2000s music videos, and video games and anime.
Do you ever think of making your own video game? Because so many artists now that the game engines are accessible, I've been starting to map, globally all the artists who work with video games, and many artists have realized video games. Precious Okoyom told me the other day that they have an unrealized video game. Did you ever think of making your own video game?
I think I do every time.
And any other kind of projects you want to talk about which have not happened yet? As you know, I'm always interested in unrealized projects, and it's interesting, we know a great deal about architects' unrealized projects as they publish them through competitions, but we know very little about artists, poets, novelists, designers' unrealized projects. They're usually unknown. And there is a sort of a wide spectrum or range of unrealized projects. There are projects which are too big to be realized, there are projects which are too expensive to be realized, there are projects which are too time-intense to be realized, there are also projects which are kind of simply unrealizable or partially unrealizable. I mean, Siamajani wanted to make a sculpture from the Earth to the Moon, so that obviously remained unrealized. So these are the slightly utopic projects. Then there are projects which are realizable, but not realizable just because of circumstances. Ete Latnan told me always she wanted to build a house, and I asked her then to actually draw that house so that it could one day be built. And before her passing at 96, she actually drew it, and Simone Fatal, her partner, is now building the house. Which is very magical, and I was kind of thinking, there's also projects which are censored. I think censorship is another reason why projects don't happen sometimes. And then there's of course also Doris Lessing always told me that there are projects. I think we all have sometimes these projects, projects which we would like to do but don't dare to do. I mean, I always wanted to write a novel, but I just think it would be so embarrassing that I never dare to do it. So in a way, that's a self.
Oh my God, do it.
So yeah, maybe that's a self-censor project, right? So I was curious within this whole realm of the unbuilt, if you could maybe tell us about one or two of your favorite unrealized projects.
Ooh, okay, I think I might have turned into a pragmatist without knowing it, but I don't. I think these unrealized project fantasies don't stay that way for very long, and I think I fantasize within often a realm of near reality for the most part. I guess all that to say, I'm already kind of working on my biggest unrealized project, which is to learn how to sculpt marble. So that's been a total fetish and a fantasy for a long time. And now I'm doing it, and I'm almost finished my first marble sculpture, which is giving me butterflies right now. That's the thing I'm the most excited about. I to be honest with you, my next confirmed performance commission is in spring 2026. A bunch of stuff will happen in between then, probably. But I'm super excited after the craziest, spring to early summer of my life, be taking some time to get inspired again and, travel with my partner who's here and, just learn some new skills and I don't know.
It's a great answer. We look forward to seeing this marble sculpture, and I think that is a great moment to open it up for questions. But before that, a big round of applause for Miles.
And Hans.
And before we have the microphone for 2 or 3 questions from you, we do have a question from Marina Abramovic, which...
Yeah, so whoever goes first from this audience is going to have to follow that, and that's okay. But I'm going to be really... I think whoever does, I'm going to buy a drink for their bravery.
Anyway, so Marina, who actually has been such a big admirer of your practice and also your mentor, we thought nothing more beautiful than have a question from her.
She's my mom.
And I'm going to play it now. And as you know, she still has the key of the Serpentine, because when she did her project at the Serpentine, which I'm sure some of you saw, she had the key every day because she, basically lived in the Serpentine, and she's the only artist who still has the key.
I love that. Does it still work? You didn't change the locks on her?
It does work.
Create limits.
Can you say it again?
Who create limits?
Great. Did we all get that, folks?
Did you hear it?
Who creates limits?
Yeah. So that's the question to you, Miles. Who creates limits?
I did hear her say that like an hour and a half ago. I probably should have been prepared. It feels obvious to say it, but I think it's us, it's our bodies. It depends for what, obviously it feels naive to not acknowledge things like race and class and, like in a broader societal picture. But I think just in terms of within the boundaries of what we are afforded in this life, within our particular facility, I'd like to think it's us. That's what I think about every time I'm going through a performance, and I need to kind of get past myself in order to get into that full surrender to the body and to whatever may come. I think it's us.
Beautiful answer. Do we have questions for Miles? We have a question here. If you can have the microphone, please. I think there's a roving microphone. Thank you so much.
You just followed up Marina, by the way, so I owe you a drink.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm obviously really big fan of yourself and Marina Abramovic, and I lost count how many times I went to her show at the Royal Academy of Arts. And I've got about 2 or 3 questions, so I'll try not to take up too much of your time. And I did also see your amazing performance at the Hayward, which was just like amazing. That was really good. Being a performance artist myself, I've got 2 or 3 questions. The main one is, how do you prepare for your performances? Are you talking about, mindset? I find it really hard doing performance art. Obviously, I'm not in the same league as you or Marina Abramovic, but I do make myself do them, and I talk to paintings from long 18th century, in particular, like Angelica Kaufman around the corner at the Royal Academy of Arts, Mary Moser. I'm not going to go about my art practice, but I just want to know, how do you prepare yourself for those performances? Because I really struggle. I have to prep myself for quite a few days in advance.
Tag on the second question, and I might be able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
So, and then the next question, sorry, I wrote them all down on my phone, actually. So give me a minute. So the first one was about Marina Abramovic. And then how do you, convince galleries to show your work? Because I have a real problem with galleries. Generally, whenever I say performance art, even now in 2024, they usually go backwards, and they're just like, because they're looking at they're looking for something that they're going to be able to sell. Obviously, performance art is really hard to sell. I know you managed to sell one recently, but so there's 2 things that I struggle with. Obviously,
Okay. Preparation, physical therapy, cupping, things like that. I have a physical therapist who I work with who used to work with Cirque du Soleil, actually, who used to prep all the acrobats and things like that. So I kind of give her a sense of what I'm doing, and then she sort of tears me down and builds me back up just to do that one thing. But otherwise, I don't know. I like being a little unprepared. I prepare a lot physically, diet, whatever. It depends on the show. But simple things, cutting out alcohol for a while before, things like that, you know. But then I like being a little unprepared mentally, because I think it's more engaging and more interesting and more important to look at someone who is not super like going into it like a stone, you know. You kind of want to be able to relate to and see the variations. And what you'll see when you go see Oyster Knife, which I encourage you all to, and as well as Douglas Gordon, you know, is that I go through hell and back. And I think that those very human kind of like ups and downs are just like really important to the product of the work. Galleries. I'm not represented by a gallery yet, so I don't think I could give you good advice on that. I've developed good relationships with institutions as an artist, which I feel very lucky for. And I've made a ton of objects, you know, video work, sculpture, you know, as well as remnants from the performances that, you know, but it's a hard question. Because, yeah, getting out of that gig economy is something I've been trying to do for, I mean, I might be in my mid-20s, but I've been doing this for 10 years, and I haven't quite, you know, I think that's what a lot of what Marina has been doing in her lifetime, is trying to make performance at that same level as painting and sculpture, and it's still in process, but, you know, I'll let you know when I figure it out.
There's also John Latham and Barbara Stevini's model. I think is always interesting, you know, because in a way they were thinking about economy of artists when they did the artist placement group. It's again an example from London. You know, they invented this in London, and they had this idea that every corporation, you know, every company, every government should have an artist in residence and an artist on the board. And if that would be realized, you know, that would create an interesting situation for a lot of artists also, you know, who don't work with objects. So I think to kind of return to this APG idea is sort of a fascinating thing. We can take one or two more questions.
Thank you. Hello. So first of all, thank you so much for this talk. I want to say as well that you have a very luxurious voice. Like there's some, seriously, there's something very, very calming about listening to your thought process and how you observe and digest and convey information. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. And I wanted to ask you, and it's been briefly touched upon, but I'm very interested in expanding one's parameters for existence and transcending oneself. And I feel that, you know, obviously you might be physically prepared, mentally maybe not so prepared, but when you're in the throes of a performance, if you could give any specific time about when you really felt like you transcended yourself, or I don't know how to describe it necessarily, but I know you spoke about some mentors that were looking for God. Is that what you're looking for? What are you looking for? What do you see? And I'm very interested in particular about your Saint Sebastian performance, especially finding out that those are real arrows in your body and trying to understand how you felt during that.
Thank you. God, now I'm like really, really aware of trying to sound luxurious. I've never gotten that before. I don't know. I can't say I do existentialism for the most part. I just kind of talk about the things that I feel and that I know to be there. And I think that it's a really big question, and I don't know if I can like quite hit it. But I will say that one of the things that I've noticed, I never came to duration from a place of wanting to transcend my body or anything like that. It's actually very simple, and I don't think people really ask me this question a lot, but I came to duration as a means of accessibility, period, point blank. For me, it was about creating an installation that people could come and see for opening hours, like a sculpture, because I was really inspired by that format. And I looked at the Winged Victory of Samothrace and all of these, sculptures in the Louvre and the Met and whatever, and I was like, this is the kind of art that I want to make, and this is the relationship I want people to have with my work. So that was always sort of like where I was, like to kind of get ahead of that conversation. That's always where I was sort of coming from, and the research into transcendence and the ephemeral and all, the sort of the deeper things that happened to me through those 8-hour pieces of just trying to be there for opening hours for people, because I hate coming to see 45-minute performances in a concrete, uncomfortable box. Really turned into of course, so much there for me, for the performers, in terms of what you access through your body. And sort of the research stemmed out of that. So sort of a preface, but I would say that part of the reason I keep coming back to this medium and to what I do over and over and over again, and part of why I love it, is that I feel like by the end, by the last minute, by the last few seconds, which I never know when it is, but I always feel it, I feel as though I've touched on something that's like a secret somewhere in my body, something that we're not supposed to know, that pain or violence or boredom or whatever kind of bring us back from. And if you pass the threshold of that through the sort of hypnosis of these pieces, you kind of tap into some secret that I kind of, tend to attribute to some divine or whatever. And I know that is there, and I access it, I read it, I look into it, I feel it. And then when you come back to Earth, you can't bring it with, it's something you can't bring with you. It's like you leave it behind, and then you get back to Earth, and then you forget. And then I have to do it all over again. So it just feels like this kind of exercise where I'm like, I know something was there, I know what I felt, I know what, experience, transcendental experience, whatever I had, but I don't really like thinking of it in terms of that. I just sort of like to experience it. I know the audience feels it. It's like a moment of magic. We don't have to talk about it. It'll happen again and again and again, and not just through me, through everything. And I think that's the closest I've ever gotten to an idea of God. But it's by no means spiritual, superstitious, religious, even metaphysical. I feel like it's a profoundly physical thing. It's hard to talk about, but it's also very concrete. I hope that made sense.
One last question.
Hit us with a juicy one. Pressure's on.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's really, really inspiring. To follow up on the subject and to connect a bit more with Marina Abramovich, when you look at her retrospective in Royal Academy, you can see that in her journey, she went through some self-harming practices to kind of more spiritual and therapeutic works, and probably some other performance artists as well in their practices. So I was wondering if in your practice it's you feel like it's the case as well, or not at all, and what's your journey?
My work's not about pain, and it's never been about pain. It's never going to be about pain. That's it.
There could not be a better conclusion. I hope you can all see the exhibition of Douglas and Miles. And I was actually thinking a lot about Psycho 24 Hours, because when I came for the first time to the UK, it was just about after having organized my first exhibition in the kitchen. I organized an exhibition in my student apartment. And kind of based on that, I was invited to give a lecture tour in the UK by the Henry Moore Sculpture Trust, in 7 cities. So it was kind of in London, and then it went on to Leeds, and also to Ireland, Northern Ireland was Belfast, Dublin, and then it was also Manchester and Bristol and so on. And it ended in Glasgow. And it was weird because I had never done a lecture in my life, and so I had only done the kitchen show, and so I could talk about it for 15, 20 minutes, but not more. So then I asked my friends Fischli Weiss, Swiss artists, and they said, it was a time pre-digital, so we had these VHS cassettes, now like very old medium. And they gave me this cassette, of the way things go, the famous chain reaction of Fischli Weiss. And they said, it's very easy, you talk for 15, 20 minutes, and then you say, I brought a video for everyone, and people will be enchanted. And then you do a Q&A. So that was my kind of first lecture. And in Glasgow, it was different from any other city, because basically, after the talk at 11 o'clock, the whole thing at 10 o'clock, it had not ended, because all these amazing artists in Glasgow said, you cannot leave town without having seen my studio. And so we made studio visits until like 2 or 3 a.m. and then, ended in a bar in Glasgow, and that's how I met Douglas Gordon. It was just before he sort of had done Psycho 24 Hours, but he had already this idea of, talking about time. And we talked about this idea that, art, what Rauschenberg said, that art history at the end of the day is so much more about space than about time. And this idea of how to liberate time and all of that. And we also talked about rituals, because I think one of the very sort of beautiful connection between Miles's work and Douglas's Psycho 24 Hours is that it has a lot to do with rituals, and that we live in an age which is maybe also, as Tarkovsky said, slightly bereft of rituals, and that we need to reintroduce rituals. And it was really magical, Miles, to listen to you tonight. And one of the things which I was thinking throughout the conversation, which maybe links all of your works, is something Suzanne Césaire once said, and I know that it's a quote you love, and I really think it's in all your works. It's this idea that you are, but you also put us into a permanent state of readiness for the marvelous. So Miles, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Luca. Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Hans.
Thank you all. Another big round of applause for Miles.